If I had to describe Pete Townshend in one word, it'd have to be ambitious. As the primary songwriter of The Who, Townshend was always pushing the boundaries of what rock music could be, and we can see that adventurous spirit on full display in their 1967 album, The Who Sell Out. You thought I was going to say Tommy, didn't you? Don't worry. We'll get there. The Who Sell Out was one of the earliest rock concept albums presented as a pirate radio broadcast complete with tongue-in-cheek product placements for baked beans, deodorant, and acne cream. It was a critical darling, receiving near-universal praise for its humor and its musicality, but it struggled commercially, coming across as too silly and weird for a rock scene that was starting to take itself a lot more seriously. So, with those mixed results behind him, Townshend did what he does best. He went further. Writing Sell Out had sparked his interest in the narrative power of music. For his next project, he wanted to take that to its limit, fusing the musical aesthetic of rock with the narrative structure of an opera to make Tommy. Tommy is often called the first rock opera, which isn't quite true. That title probably belongs to SF Sorrow by Pretty Things. But Tommy was the album that made the format famous, inspiring other great rock operas throughout the 70s, like The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway, and, of course, The Wall. But while it was one of the first of its kind, Tommy was already pushing boundaries, using the double album format to tell a convoluted, difficult, and at times perverse story of a child tricked by his parents into believing he can't see or hear. It's a challenging work, with a lot going on both narratively and musically, but Townshend was also the quintessential rock star. As he wrote, it was important to him that the songs could still be performed live, and that each one could stand on its own. So while for the most part the songs on Tommy are only known these days by die-hard Who fans and theater kids, a couple tracks have broken into the mainstream, and leading the pack is its lead single, one of the story's most climactic moments where Tommy Walker finally finds the path that leads him to who he's supposed to be. That's right, he's a pinball wizard. Let's take it apart. This video is brought to you by Beverly Bunny and the Misdirected Mystery. They're not paying me or anything, it's just a cool thing my friend is making that I think you should check out. More on that at the end of the video. The song starts like this, with a quiet acoustic guitar panned hard to right and an even quieter echo on the left. This echo is delayed by slightly less than an eighth note, which is easier to hear if I slow it down. And that small misalignment with the grid makes the time here feel wonky and distorted, creating a warped sensory experience not unlike that of Tommy Walker. Or, okay, probably not like Tommy's experience in a literal sense, that'd be hard to recreate with sound, but this out-of-time echo captures the sense of isolation Tommy feels, and they're gonna do something really cool with that in a minute, so keep it in mind. First though, we gotta talk chords. The basic pattern here is simple. Townshend strums a full chord on the downbeat, then lets it ring as he plucks eighth notes on a single string for the rest of the bar, which leaves a lot of space for that echo to bounce around in. That repeated low note is always F sharp, keeping this constant drone throughout that anchors the rest of the harmony. Above that, he starts with a high voicing of a B minor triad, then each bar lowers one note. First, he drops the high F sharp down to E, then the D becomes C sharp, B becomes A sharp, and suddenly we're on an F sharp 7 chord. I could put chord symbols over these middle ones if I wanted, but I think that's missing the point. This is less a chord progression and more a voice leading exercise, and the journey is shaped by this slow march downward as each note in B minor takes its own step. Once we're on F sharp 7, he could reset the progression by resolving back to B minor, but instead he lets it continue to melt, stepping A sharp down to A. Here, things start to get darker. The chords had this clear arc to them with a natural endpoint, but he seems to have missed the turn and wound up somewhere he wasn't supposed to be. And if that seems like an overreaction to a minor 7 chord, check out what he does next. This is the moment where my ears sit up and go, what the heck was that? And if you're wondering the same thing, it turns out all he's doing is fretting that low F sharp and playing the top 3 strings open. And that was always gonna be dissonant with a half-step rub in the bottom between F sharp and G, but I actually think the bigger factor here is that this is where he starts to break the rules. Up to now, he's been really consistent about moving one note at a time, but here he moves 2. The A and C sharp drop to G and B, and the connection between chords is severed. Next, he breaks another rule, finally moving off that low F sharp and giving us a sort of E minor chord with a G in the bass. At this point, that smooth, steady walk from the first half is completely gone, so instead of trying to find it again, he just starts pounding another F-sharp 7 to build into the actual song. We're never going to see this intro progression again, but it sets the stage beautifully for what's to come. That F-sharp 7 transitions into the actual main progression, and I want to revisit the echo. It's still there, and as far as I can tell, it's still got the same offset, but the new metric landscape has changed the way it feels. Before, it sat awkwardly in between the various eighth notes, but here, Townshend is playing a much more frantic 16th note line, complete with syncopated accents, so he kinda catches up to the rhythmic chaos of the echo. It's still there, but it's no longer out of place. If we're saying that misaligned echo represents Tommy's sense of isolation, then carrying it into this new section feels like him finding relief and acceptance through pinball. To quote Townshend,
"Tommy's games aren't games. They're like the first real thing he's done in his life. This is Tommy's first big triumph."
In fact, the rhythm itself kind of evokes pinball. Townshend's playing a double traceo, which means he's grouping each bar into 4 groups of 3/16ths and then 2 groups of 2 at the end. This is a common rhythm in rock, building excitement with its constantly changing speed, but it's also a pretty good metric metaphor for the ebb and flow of a game of pinball. It's a bouncy rhythm, and you can feel the ball bounce with it. The section starts on B sus4, which gives it this shimmering, indeterminate quality that quickly resolves to B. Now, you may have noticed that while the intro started on B minor, here they've switched to major. And we're going to see a lot of that. For the rest of the song, every single chord is either major, or in some cases a sus4 that resolves to major. And it's not a simple 3 chords and the truth thing either. He plays 7 different major triads, which, for those of you counting along at home, is all the major triads in both B major and B minor, plus an extra one from B Phrygian. The tonality is twisting itself in knots in order to keep the immediate musical surface sounding unrelentingly major. Now, does that represent Tommy's unbridled elation at finally finding something he excels at, or is it the denial and escapism of hiding in the arcade from his otherwise pretty awful life? Or maybe it's the conflicted emotions of the local pinball champion impressed by Tommy's skill, but also upset at losing his status. I dunno. I think all those interpretations make sense. Reading Townshend's interviews about the project, the unbridled elation one seems closest to his vision, but there's still plenty of room for different symbolisms if something else fits better for you. Anyway, we can see this constant major thing in action in the verse progression, where he walks from 1 down to 5, borrowing chords from the parallel minor to fill the gap. This resembles a traditional rock progression sometimes called the Andalusian cadence, but by making the first chord major, it takes on this over-the-top brightness that defies expectation. And he even kinda teases the listener with it, setting up each one with a sus4 that momentarily hides the 3, as if he's saying, I don't know, maybe this next one's gonna be minor. But it never is. This also gives it some really cool voice leading. The major third of each chord is a half step above the suspended fourth of the next, so there's this smoothly descending chromatic line that runs through most of the verse, harmonized with power chords to fill out the intended functions. It has a sort of fluidity to it, a cascading flow state that seems to reflect Tommy's intuitive mastery of the game. That chromatic line might just be a coincidence of other choices Townshend made with a harmony, but it's such an effective musical statement that I actually wouldn't be surprised if this is why he made some of those choices. It really ties the whole thing together beautifully. But there is another thing to consider. Tommy's a rock opera after all. All the songs are connected, and we've kinda heard this before. The same repeated sus4 to major thing shows up in a couple other songs, mostly in particularly traumatic moments. We hear it in 1921.
Got a feeling 21 is gonna be a good year.
Where Tommy witnesses his father commit a murder, and again in Cousin Kevin.
We're on our own, cousin.
Where he's left in the care of his physically abusive cousin. So what does it mean that it's also here? Well, I do think it's worth asking if this is even intentional. Tommy does have some explicit recurring leitmotifs, but they're mostly more obvious than this. Like, it's definitely intentional when this pattern comes back at the end of I'm Free, as Tommy, having regained his senses, prepares to welcome new members to his cult, which, yes, is a thing that happens in the plot of Tommy. But the connections to 1921 and Cousin Kevin are a lot more subtle. And it's not really fair to say this theme represents trauma in general. The whole first album is just a bunch of bad things happening to Tommy, and I don't hear this pattern in songs like Fiddle About or The Acid Queen, which seem equally traumatic. Plus, Cousin Kevin wasn't even written by Townshend. He gave that one to bassist John Entwistle because he didn't think he could be cruel enough, which, yikes. But also, that explains a lot about that song. And just in case you were wondering, yes, Entwistle also wrote Fiddle About for the same reason. So is this theme meant to represent something in the story, or is it just a thing The Who liked doing? I don't know, but for the sake of argument, let's assume the former. If it was a choice, why might they have made it? Well, let's look at the motivic development. In 1921, it just sits on one chord while the lyrics are happy.
Got a feeling 21 is gonna be a good year.
Then moves to a more forceful 1-5 loop in a different key when they get aggressive.
So you think 21 is gonna be a good year?
Cousin Kevin takes the figure and slides it around in half steps.
Oh, cousin, let's think of a game to play.
To reflect Kevin's sadistic playfulness, well, as we saw, Pinball Wizard finally fits it into a reasonably tonal context. And that, I think, is a pretty strong clue. In all the cases, this motif underscores the idea of recreation. In 1921, the singer is happy and at peace in his relationship, right before he gets murdered, so we get a serene, static harmony version of the theme. In Cousin Kevin, Kevin's clearly having a great time, even if Tommy isn't, so the theme gets twisted up in this atonal sprawl. And of course, Pinball Wizard is about finally finding freedom through an arcade game, so the theme is animated, but clearly consonant. That even explains its return in I'm Free, where Tommy's retreat invites participants to lose themselves and eventually find themselves again through pinball, echoing the journey Tommy himself took with the game. Anyway, Roger Daltrey's vocals mostly follow the chords, leading up to the song's famous tag.
That deaf, dumb, and blind kid sure plays a mean pinball.
I've always found this moment weirdly unsettling, and it wasn't until I started working on this video that I finally realized why. My brain really wants us to be a simple walk down the pentatonic scale,
Sure plays a mean pinball.
but it's not. Instead, where I'm expecting an E, Daltrey jumps down a major sixth past the root, then steps back up.
Sure plays a mean pinball.
The resolution's still there, but it's from the wrong direction, and the huge leap makes it even harder to follow. But it's worse than that. The thing I've been playing is, to my ears, the high harmony. Following the range from the previous lines, the main melody is probably this,
Sure plays a mean pinball.
which has a similar shape but resolves to F sharp, leaving the line feeling incomplete. And in case you're not convinced this is the main melody, it's the one Daltrey sings live,
Sure plays a mean pinball.
so at least that's how he hears it. Ending a melody on the fifth implies it's going to keep going, working its way back around to the root, but there's no second half to this section, and the harmony singing B gives it this bizarre half closure that's hard to pin down. It's arrived, but in such a weird way that it doesn't really feel like a resolution. But it's even worse than that. The low part leaps down from A, and the high part leaps down to A, so there actually is a line that satisfyingly dances around the root before resolving to it cleanly,
Sure plays a mean pinball.
but that part isn't real. I made it by Frankensteining two different voices. This is what I want to hear, and it's there, but I can't hear it. Ah! And I'm not the only one who finds this melodic shape counterintuitive. In the movie version of Tommy, Daltrey is busy playing the title character, so this song is instead sung by Elton John, who sings the high line and includes the E. Or, okay, it's an F because he's in a different key, but it's the same function. Point is, Elton John agrees with me. And that might actually be where I got the idea. You see, he included this version on the 2001 re-release of his album Caribou, which I bought at Tower Records as a kid. Please don't do the math on how old that makes me. I'm pretty sure that was the first version of Pinball Wizard I heard, so of course it's the melody I expect. I mean, all the other things I said earlier remain true. It's a weird line, and it gives the verse this indistinct sense of wrongness that foreshadows the strange path Tommy's pinball success puts him on. But am I hearing that because it's there, or because Elton John told me to look for it? There's no way to know for sure, and I'm not really convinced there's a difference. That leads into the main riff, which contains a really interesting harmonic illusion. Theoretically, moving from D major to E major is a step up, but on the guitar, D major is a weird chord. The lowest D sits really high on the instrument, and the note on the high E string is an F sharp. Moving from that chord voicing to the most natural voicing of an E major chord means stepping the top note down and dropping the root almost a full octave, turning the upward harmonic motion into a downward gesture. Again, I don't know how intentional this was. It's a pretty direct result of playing the obvious voicings for these two chords, but either way, it's a pretty clever change to the impact of the E chord, which ties into a broader observation. I know I always get in trouble when I say this, but I kind of feel like we changed keys here. I mean, what is a key but a miserable little pile of secrets, but still, this E feels more like a root than a 4 chord. And there's a bunch of reasons for that. First is length. It's a 2-bar riff, and E gets the whole second bar to itself. The syncopation in the first bar also builds up a lot of rhythmic tension that releases on the downbeat where E appears. Plus, the chords make a little more sense. We can explain these all in B, but then the D chord is a borrowed flat 3, which is a little unusual, whereas in E major, it's the flat 7. That's still a borrowed chord, but it's a much more common one, and it provides a satisfying backdoor resolution back to 1. Add to that the directional weight of that low E in the bass, and the weird vocal line that obscures B as the root, and you've got a strong case for E major here. Is it a real modulation? I mean, it only lasts 4 bars, so no, probably not. I'd probably call it an illusory tonic if I wanted to get fancy, or a fake 1 chord if I didn't. But the point is that, for a moment, the music goes on a little journey outside the key center, even if it doesn't stray far enough to really need a new map. But more importantly, the riff section also features the introduction of one Keith Moon. If you know anything about Moon, you know he's allergic to a basic rock groove, but this particular pattern isn't that far off. We've got snares on the backbeats and kicks on most of the 8th notes, but the big feature is, of course, this rolling tom fill he plays in the middle of each bar. To my ears, it sounds like this figure drags a bit, landing on beat 3 a little late, which isn't surprising. Moon was never the most technical or precise drummer, after all. He's more of a wild man. But as with everything I say in these videos, I don't mean that as a criticism. Moon's loose, erratic time feel is a key part of what makes The Who sound like The Who, and it ties perfectly with this particular song. The flurry of toms and this chaotic but ultimately predictable pattern calls to mind the frantic but controlled motion of Tommy on the buttons of his pinball machine. And again, we can look to the Elton John version to see just how much this matters. Despite Moon appearing as the drummer in the film, the recorded drum part was actually played by Elton's drummer Nigel Olsson, and while the timing is definitely more consistent, the fill is gone, and I don't think it has the same heart. Oh, and you can also hear that thing I was talking about with the chords. Elton's playing a piano where the natural voice leading from D to E is to just step everything up, and that lack of contrary motion makes the E feel a little less prominent. I don't hear quite as much ambiguity as I do when Townshend plays it. Orchestration matters. Who knew? And speaking of orchestration, we should probably talk about the electric guitar. This was actually in the first verse, playing these octave slides to the root of each chord, but in the riff section, it fully doubles the acoustic, and it's a heck of a lot louder, so it pretty much takes over the mix. I mean, not completely. The two guitars are panned hard to each side, so especially with good headphones, you can still isolate the acoustic, but this is clearly the electric's moment. It provides a cool contrast in timbre. The verses were very acoustic-driven, with the electric as an accent part, so flipping those around makes this section stand out much more from the surrounding musical material. In the second verse, they flip back again, with the acoustic taking lead and the electric moving to the background, but this time with a new idea. He does one of his octave slides, then jumps up and starts playing a high B harmonic on each downbeat. Measured in decibels, it's a much smaller sound, but that high, pure tone of the string harmonic cuts through beautifully, giving it a new sense of urgency, and if we want to read some extremely literal sound painting, maybe a good analog for the scoring bells of a pinball machine. Maybe. I'm not that committed to that particular analysis, feel free to ignore it if it seems too on the nose. That leads to another riff section, and the main difference I can find is that Moon has, for some reason, moved the triplet fill from the middle of the bar to the end. I don't have a better explanation for that than he just got restless and decided to mix things up. It doesn't really affect my hearing, but I think it's neat. That drops us into the chorus, and let's stick with Moon for a second, because his part gets weird. A couple bars in, he throws out this preposterous extended fill, That doesn't really line up with anything else in any of the other parts. In the second half, he starts adding these double cymbal hits every bar, which brings a huge amount of aggression that, again, the rest of the band is not matching. It almost sounds like he's playing a completely different song. So why? I mean, I could probably bring this back around to sounding like Pinball again, but that's getting repetitive, and I'm not really sure it's relevant here. Honestly, this is just what Keith Moon does, and it's what makes his drumming so iconic. The Who were pioneers of auto-destructive showmanship, which is a fancy way of saying they were famous for destroying their own gear. The highlight of any Who show was Townshend smashing his guitar and Moon kicking holes in his drum set. Obviously, he's not going to break a drum set in the studio, but this sort of relentless pounding way beyond what the moment actually called for musically has always been his signature, and again, it wouldn't be The Who without it. On top of that, Townshend plays a single bar loop of 4-5-1 in B with a cool semi-syncopated pattern. He's changing chords on the upbeats so the harmonic rhythm is syncopated, but his accents are still really strongly on the beats, so the actual rhythm isn't. Above that, the voices have this beautiful three-part harmony.
He's a pinball wizard, there has to be a twist.
That sort of follows those chords, but not exactly. Daltrey is clearly singing on the beats, ignoring the pickups from the guitar, and he also mostly ignores the F-sharp chord. This gives us some subtle moments of musical misalignment, not long enough to obviously clash, but enough to add a sense of complexity and maturity to the sound. After 3 bars, they work their way to a G chord,
Pinball wizard's got such a supple wrist.
and that major at all costs thing really comes to a head. So far, the harmony has been moving exclusively by 4th, 5th, or step, so we've never really had to contend with the full implications of their reckless mode mixture. But here, in the move from B major to G major, that all changes. These 2 chords are what's called chromatic mediants. Mediant means they're a third apart, and chromatic means they contradict each other. Both chords contain some sort of D, but they can't agree on which one. B major has a D sharp to G major's D natural. Placing these 2 chords right next to each other highlights the disconnect between the major and minor scales they've been flipping between. This tension was always there, but here, as the chorus comes to an end, they're drawing it out to make sure you hear it. And they use that moment of harmonic confusion to just pivot to D. Again, probably not a real key change, just a section that temporarily hides the root for a couple bars, but still, on its own, it's hard not to hear this in D major, playing what we in the music theory business call a double plagal resolution, or flat 7-4-1. 4-1 is an iconic resolution in rock, and this lets us get that same motion twice for even more sauce. On top of that, Daltrey and Townshend trade some very Mixolydian sounding melodies.
How do you think he does it? I don't know. What makes him so good?
So yeah, I think it's fair to want to hear this in D major, even if it's just a couple lines. And that's important because D major and B major are also chromatic mediants, once again disagreeing on the quality of their supposedly shared D, so when this suddenly whips back into the verse, okay, it kinda doesn't seem nearly as striking as the G did, and that's down to the suspension. Our clash is between the D and D major and the D sharp and B major, but B sus4 doesn't have a D sharp. It has an E, and D major has no opinions about the correct quality for an E. The gap here is bridged much more smoothly, which makes sense. Lyrically, this verse continues the thought directly from the bridge, so it'd be weird to have such a jarring moment effectively mid-sentence. This third verse once again features a new technique on the electric guitar, in this case a galloping rhythm on a fretted high B, that slowly swells in volume as the section goes, and just for fun, I'm gonna say this sounds like a pinball machine again. I mean, listen to it. It's so bouncy. Sometimes cigars are cigars, you know? Anyway, from there we get another riff and another chorus, but after the G chord, instead of a bridge, everyone else drops out and Townshend returns to the intro. Or okay, not the intro, but the solo acoustic strumming he played after the intro. From there, the band builds back in for one last verse, just like they did in the beginning, but I want to talk about this moment because I think it's a really cool capstone. Pinball Wizard is a pretty short song, clocking in at 3 minutes even, but as we've seen, it still develops a lot of different ideas. Resetting like this ties all that together. It's a return to the basics, washing away a lot of the complex harmonic weirdness of the middle section and recentering this simple, powerful progression, which also helps them reuse it later as a memorable motif. And that's pretty much it. They do one last verse, return to the riff, then Townshend starts playing this meandering arpeggio figure as the song fades out. The Elton John version does more, adding an extra 2 minutes of musical material, but this is a video about The Who, so I'm gonna stop here and transition into telling you about a really cool movie my friend Jacob is making. It's called Beverly Bunny and the Misdirected Mystery. It's about a rabbit detective who solves crimes, and it's adorable. I've known Jacob forever, we go back literally decades, and he's one of the most talented animators I know, so if you like what I do with my cute little elephants and whatnot, you'll love his stuff, because he's actually good at drawing. In addition to being an old high school friend, Jacob's also an award-winning filmmaker with a bunch of amazing short films, but this is his first feature-length project. He's been working on it for years now, and it looks so good. I'm so excited for this, but he needs to finish it first. For that, he's running a Kickstarter, and I'm blatantly abusing my platform as a professional YouTuber to ask you to consider supporting it. He didn't ask me to do that or anything, I just really like his stuff, but if any of this sounds at all appealing to you, you should really click the link in the description to learn more. They're heading into the last week of the campaign right now, so you'll have to act fast, but even if it's too late, click the link anyway so you can see what the movie's about and get hyped for its release. And hey, thanks for watching, and thanks to our featured patrons, Susan Jones, Jill Sungard, Howard Levine, Warren Hewitt, Damian Fuller Sutherland, John Hancock, Neil Moore, and Jeff. Check out the Nebula cut of this video for some extra closing thoughts, and as always, keep on rockin'.